inquiry into community assets. I know that we have some additional members joining us today, and also we have some guests to help us with our inquiry, and welcome to everybody. But first off, I just wanted to make sure that we start recording the session so that it can be viewed later online. And the first item I've got is apologies, which I know we received from Cheryl Philpott, Councillor Cheryl Philpott, that is. And I also understand one of the contributors who was due to come with us this afternoon, Rosemary Harvard-Jones. She can't make it this afternoon now, but we have a written submission from her, and a colleague also is here as well. So if I can just go onto item 2, disclosures of interest. Any disclosures of interest out there? Okay, thank you. And what I just have to remind you is there's a prohibition of whip votes on a scrutiny panel. So just to remind you of that. Minutes of the previous meeting, if we want to have a look at those, and we'll go through them page by page. Okay, so a quick look. If anybody wants to raise any points of accuracy on page 1, and then on page 2. Are people happy with those as being a true and accurate record of the meeting? Anybody like to? Yeah. That's a proposal from Councillor Jeffrey. Would like to second that? And second by Councillor Locke. Okay, thank you. Just moving on then to section 5, which is public questions. We haven't received any formal public questions today, but we do have members of the public who are with us for the panel discussion to help inform this inquiry. And if I can then go on to section 6, which is the stakeholders consultation, which is about the public, elected councillors and community councils. We've written out as an inquiry to a number of different bodies, and also asked via the council website and other mediums for feedback and ideas about the community asset transfer process. And I'm happy to say that we've had a number of responses, and some of the people involved in those responses are here and are hopefully going to join us also online later. So I think what we would probably do is, as the members have already received copies of each of the responses, I thought, well, I would introduce some of those people who responded, pick out some of the main issues, and then give them a chance to tell us what their thing that they would like us to take away. It's the main issue that they've raised that we can put in to our considerations for recommendations to the wider council. So as we have Adrian Lester from Swansea Co-Housing in the room with us. Welcome, Adrian. If you need to speak, all you need to do is press the little hand button as well. So we've had a read through the submission, which came from you and your colleagues, and we welcome that. We noted as well in the submission about the process happens in other councils. And on the back of that submission, we also added into our desktop research, which will come later, the Southampton example and the spirit of that. And I just thought this might be an opportunity for you to say a little bit about your thoughts, and maybe to give us a sort of a takeaway, something that you'd think that we should, as a group, take away and bring forward. What's your main thing that you think that should be improved? Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. Really, I think the sort of overarching thing in our response was looking at the tone, the general attitude of different councils towards community asset transfer, and some being much more proactive in that sense than Swansea, and seeing much wider benefits. And if there was going to be one take home, I think it would be on those wider benefits, that it's not just about the value of the asset. It's about the long-term value that services provided through that asset can provide, the long-term value that asset, if it's a built asset, being maintained in good condition can provide, and the long-term savings to the council from not having to maintain that built asset after it's been transferred. So they're probably the key strands that go significantly beyond the sort of the immediate realization of market value. And I think that needs to be built into the thinking, so that rather than being restrictive about the conditions under which a transfer might take place. Actually, it's more of a process of seeing the potential benefits and then verifying those benefits look realizable, and starting from that positive mindset that the other councils seem to.
Thank you. Has anybody got any questions they would like to ask Mr. Lester directly about the submission? I've got a couple of things I can pick up. Is there anybody out there in the online? Okay. Councillor Holly.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Mr. Lester, for your submission. It's quite interesting reading it about the way you comment this afternoon with regards to how do you assess the long-term benefit and what benefit you would receive from that asset transfer. The problem, as I see it, and the way you're discussing it, is how do you measure that long-term benefit? And I think that's something that's part of the reason that this inquiry panel needs to look at the benefits of asset transfer and what would you consider to be long-term as opposed to what we might consider to be long-term, because I have a feeling that, you know, a council's civic time is probably around about 4 or 5 years between elections, so it's difficult for us to, given the legal problems that exist with community transfer, to actually do one within that period of time, for the want of a better term. So I think it'd be interesting to hear what you have to say about what you consider to be long-term sustainability and benefit.
Yeah, I mean, in fairness, the sort of the electoral cycle of 4 or 5 years is at the bottom end of that spectrum. Not necessarily completely outside it, but definitely at the low end. I think there are benefits to be realised in that timescale. It depends on the particular project that's in question and the particular asset. When I wrote the response and consulted with my colleagues, we were all thinking more in the sort of 20 years timescale than the 5. And there's a wider picture about sound financial planning in government, both local and national, and actually needing to think beyond short-term electoral cycles. I would hope actually that in Swansea, where we've got a party holding the council with a significant majority and therefore a fair likelihood of continuing to do so, that sort of thinking might be in play.
If I may come back, Chair, the problem with that is quite simply the financial cycle as well, and how the council will adopt to its financial cycle, given the pressures that it has, you know, for the last 20-25 years. You know, we nearly always have to save money, and we nearly always have that financial constraint. So to give that benefit of 20 years, you need to have a financial plan of money being received by the local authority to last that period of time, which is very, very unlikely. So I appreciate what you say, and I understand what you say, but I think the problem with it is how we as councillors and how the council actually determine that length of period that we can have that, if you like, that benefit gain or over community transfer.
If I can come back in on that, I mean, if we flip this on its head, if the council is genuinely constrained in terms of the length of time over which it is able to recognise a benefit, then actually putting that in black and white in the policy would be immensely helpful to those organisations applying for a community asset transfer, because we'd know what we were working with in that first instance.
I think that's a very good idea and something that needs to be considered by this panel.
I think that's a good point to pick up. One of the things that struck me about your submission, and also your references as well to Southampton, was the capacity that you felt the community had to run services which weren't necessarily council services, but from former council property. And I thought that was quite a strength of what you were trying to say, that there was something in asset transfer which wasn't only about protecting services in the original formats or buildings in their original formats, but something new and different. And I wondered if you had any particular ideas that you thought Swansea should be looking to entertain, given your housing background.
Yeah, so that, I mean, again, this ties in almost to the previous point, is that it's about the open-mindedness of the way these things are looked at. And the existing Swansea policy seems very much to be asset transfer is a way to carry on the service in the place without the council having to pay for the service. Whereas other councils, and Southampton's one example, I cited a couple of others as well, really look to it as a way of providing a service in an asset which is available. So taking the housing example, I mean, we're looking to provide essentially affordable housing in perpetuity through a community land trust. And the buildings in which that's done do not have to be, previous housing. They could be previous office space, they could be previous industrial space, they could be previous derelict buildings that were housing or something else many years ago. And by doing so, again, we come back to where we just were in terms of the long-term benefit. That means that the housing burden on the council is then reduced in time going forward. Housing, I cite that because it's what we're looking at, but it's one example. I can imagine a number of other sorts of organisations that might be providing various social type services and needing premises from which to do so, that community asset transfer could provide the right assets in the right locations.
As somebody considering or potentially considering community asset transfer, what support would be desirable from the council to take you through that process?
I think, again, I'm aware we're not necessarily the most typical example, because we've got people on our board with a policy background. We've got architects and developers on our board, so people who are perhaps more used to the processes. From our point of view, having clear guidance which stated those conditions and constraints from the outset, but also gave a reasonable idea of how to make the case and was open to the concept in the first place, would be the first stage. It would also be immensely helpful to have known points of contact within the council, people to contact about particular assets that we'd identified and were interested in. And again, we've got some of those contacts, but we didn't have in our early days, and other organisations I'm sure don't, and will feel immediately lost when sort of confronting the system. So yeah, contactability, clarity of documentation, clarity of requirements, and possibly case studies, examples, submissions, those sorts of things. But I say possibly because unless very much going down the line of a different existing council, it's difficult to do that stuff until a new system's been spun up for a while. But as these things get developed, then actually providing that, and maybe even an element of mentoring from other organisations which have done this before to people hoping to do it, I can imagine would be very helpful.
I think those are two really interesting points you made about case studies and mentoring, maybe from external organisations who've gone through the process rather than necessarily through the council itself, because capacity is always going to be an issue faced by the council. Does anybody have any other questions or points they'd like to raise with Mr. Lester? I can't see any there, but thank you, Adrian. It's been really useful because the points you've made there are some of the things that we've come across in other areas as well during our discussion so far. So we would certainly look in our considerations when we pull together what we recommend to the council, some of the key things, this case studies ideas, the mentoring ideas, the point of contact, which I know is quite a frequent thing that's come out, and also the clarity of it. And there is a different spirit, isn't there, in the Southampton example than many others that I've looked at, which is, it's a positive engagement of, rather than seeing a service continue, seeing a new opportunity in that sense. Yeah, of course.
One other thing, and it's something I touched on in our submission that I just wanted to flag. There's been at least one site, and I don't want to name sites given that this is going to be made public, but there's been at least one site that we had the potential to be involved in, which was adversely affected politically by council activity around a different nearby site, which actually we could also have been interested in. And really, that was to an extent predictable. These were going to be controversial. They were obviously controversial places, and I would urge the council, when you have an asset that you know has the potential to be controversial in its disposal, go out and talk to community organisations first. You're not committing yourself to anything, but it may provide a route to actually dispose of that asset, which in both the cases I'm thinking about, the council is still responsible for looking after, to dispose of that asset in an expedient manner with a positive community outcome, rather than both ending up stuck with it and, because of the form of proposal or consultation that's taken place, ending up with such a community backlash that no one else can do anything with it either.
Okay, thank you. The next person that we have, I think is just online with us now, is Councillor Matthew Bailey, who gave us a very useful submission recently with 10 key points that he wanted as takeaways, ranging from consultation to the process of support. And what I wanted to do with you, Councillor Bailey, if because I can see you online there, I wondered if, because we've already a submission, and thank you for bringing that forward, if you could give us the main takeaway, the main thing that you feel could improve the community asset process at Swansea.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, apologies for coming in late. I had technical issues trying to get online. I'll try and keep it brief. So I've been involved in a couple of community asset transfer, both directly and indirectly, but I've just tried to be as forthcoming as possible to give sort of not just the issues, but how we can overcome those. So you've probably already covered these already, but for example, the first one would be to have a single point of contact for asset transfers. You've probably established this already, and I think the gentleman who spoke previously said it would be good to have a names contact within the authority. We have had a single point of contact, but quite often that person has other things in their portfolio, and I know what costings and financial pressures come into it, but it would be really good just to have one person whose sole job is community asset transfers and they've got nothing else within their portfolio. The second point that I raised was to have a transfer process for taking on a community asset transfer. Seeing the documents that were sent out prior to this meeting, I think you've already got really good examples from other local authorities. So I think that ball is already moving, so I don't need to sort of labour on that point any more than I need to. I've said that I think there really should be a minimum threshold for community consultation. So quite often I think what's important to a small group of people isn't always important to the wider community. So I think when we're using a community asset, or we're going to change the use of a community asset, or somebody else is going to take it over, I think there has to be some level of consultation with the wider community. What that looks like, I'm not quite sure. But trying to get a cross section of the community, I think, is really important. One of the issues I had when we were looking to take on a community asset transfer is trying to get detailed costings. One of the big issues is the authority, for example, if we were going to take over a park, the authority doesn't really have split down costings as to how much it costs to cut the grass in that park, how much it costs to do the weed management in that park, how much the insurance is for that particular play area, because the authority tends to sort of group these into large payments. So they have an insurance for the whole council. They have a parks team that cut the grass for all the parks. So it'd be really good if a group wanted to take over a particular asset, that the council could work with that community group to try and help them get an idea of how much it's going to cost. You know, they're not experts, but the council does have that expertise that they could sort of lend out to help them develop some sort of business plan, just to make sure that their idea is feasible. The other thing I've looked at then is legal queries. I think legal queries in general, whatever you are in the world, take forever. But again, just having a single point of contact, not just for the community asset transfers, but having a single point of contact just for the legal side of things, that can also slow things down. And sometimes you're waiting months for a simple answer. So a single point of contact for legal queries would really be useful. The other thing I've said is that with regards to finances, I know everybody sort of, when they're taking on a community asset transfer, they come to the council and they say, we're taking this off you, we're going to save you X amount, can you give us this money up front? And people want that bowl of money to get going. Naturally, there's a risk with the council doing that. They could give that group the money. Either the council hasn't got the money, or they give the group the money and that group can go bust, or they could cease to exist fairly soon after. I think it would be really good if the council could consider earmarking how much it would cost to run that community asset transfer if the council didn't hand it over. So, for example, if that asset transfer cost the council £10,000 per year to run, the council could give that group that's taken over that asset £30,000, so 3 years worth of costings, but they only give that £30,000 after 3 years of that group successfully running that asset. So it's what the council would have paid anyway, but they're paying it in retrospect, if that makes sense. So that could help the group as well financially, and that probably might bring some other people to the table to take on more assets as well. So it lessens the risk for the council and lessens the risk for that group as well. And I think that more or less sums up, yeah, just looking at what I've said here, but that more or less sums up of some of the things I think that could be done to make the asset transfer process a lot better as well.
Thank you. That's really useful, and it sort of compounds on what you've said in your written submission as well. I think the key thing you spoke about, almost like a minimum level of consultation being important, and I definitely think that's something that we need to look at. And one of the things that I read in your submission, correct me if I'm wrong, is that there were a number of people interested in the same assets, and it was the process by which that there was clarity about that. Because I think at the time it was a community council and also another third sector organisation were both interested in having the same asset. But can you tell us a little bit about how you felt that went?
Yeah, it was just, I think the community council at the time, I was a community council at the time, we just sort of found out by accident that there was another group also having discussions about taking over a local play area. And both had a really good case to put forwards, and both had lots to offer. It's just for a couple of months we had two groups sort of go in different directions. When there could have been a tied-in approach, we could have come together and worked together from the start. And I think that could have ironed out a lot of issues if we'd worked together from the beginning. That could have just been miscommunication, cross ties. But perhaps that single point of contact within the authority, if we had that moving forwards, that might help as well. So if two groups are going to the same person, they could say, hold on, there's actually other interest in this asset as well. Why don't you look working together from the start? As it happens, I think they tried that, but it was too far down the line, and they sort of diverged too much at that point, so it couldn't happen.
Thank you. Wearing your sort of community council hat there, Matthew, do you feel that community councils, where there's an asset looking to be transferred, should be almost like a guaranteed consultee, somebody that should always be told about what's going on?
Definitely, I think the benefit with the community council is that they are elected, they're publicly accountable. If people aren't happy with something, they can go directly to a community council and hold them to account for their actions. And they are one of the closest levels of democracy. So yeah, I think they should definitely be a statutory consultee in any process for asset transfers.
Thank you. Has anybody else got any points or things they'd like to raise with Councillor Bailey? Thank you, Matthew. I found your response really comprehensive and really useful, and hopefully we can take some of those points forward and have a look at how we can adopt them into future policy and procedure of how we look at community asset transfer. Okay.
Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, thanks. There are a number of other people who I've got listed here who have given a response, one of which was Rosemary Hubbard-Jones, who's also a member of the public, who's a colleague at Code Housing, but she was also talking about a number of other areas. And one of her key points in her absence I would raise is about consultation, making sure that there is a basic level of consultation for any community asset transfer. And I think that's quite a common theme that keeps coming back. There were also submissions from Councillor Chris Evans and from Councillor Joe Hale. And Joe, you're there. I think both of your consultation responses were reasonably similar. Would you like to speak to us about what your main points are there?
I think that's why I was going to come in earlier with your first speaker. He raised the issue of there being not only public consultation, but there was quite a problematic transfer that they didn't want to, or they didn't eventually become involved in. And I'm just wondering where, I mean, we as councillors and the authority as a whole is only custodians of the assets of our estate. So I'm just wondering where public opinion does lie. And I did give a good example of public toilets being shut. And this isn't under this administration. This has been going on for years. And I'm just wondering why we get to a position where public utilities seem to be fair game to be sold off, so I presume to raise some sort of revenue against public opinion. And I'm not led by public opinion, but at the same time, when you get to an age where you might need a public facility, it's a little bit annoying, isn't it, to see that something's been turned into some sort of coffee hub, or I don't know, but which doesn't provide a toilet facility. So that sort of thing. I'm just wondering where the officers sit in do they take any notice of public opinion? Do they take notice of the fact that maybe, say, a group of people want to take over a park, but 3/4 of the local population don't want the park to be taken over? What are we doing about our open spaces? So I'm just wondering where that sits and how that decision comes to fruition.
Thanks, Councillor Hale. I agree. It's about the consultation stage, really, isn't it? Making sure that that this is something that the whole community, or virtually the majority of the community, can support. It comes through the Welsh Government guidance on community asset transfer. It is something that the full community should be engaged in and benefit from, potentially. And I think that's a key question for the panel. How do we look at getting some sort of minimum version of consultation, and who's responsible for that consultation taking place? So, for example, if it is the person wishing for the community asset transfer to take place, what checks and balances do we make sure as a council that that's representative of people's opinions in the local area? Because we can all find some form of consultation that will suit us. And that's a really key thing. And I know there are lots of issues where that may well be the case around the city, where people are asking those kinds of questions about what place does the general public have its say, as it were. So just to pick up from what you were saying as well, Joe, is that I think very similar ethic was put forward by Councillor Chris Evans, who I can't see online at the moment, in his email. He saw us as custodians of the public estate, and where possible not to be looking at community asset transfer. I think that would be a fair summary of his views. And I think we had similar views from maybe some of the other panel members who were with us today. They were concerned that we were looking to do asset transfer to save money, rather than thinking of what's in the long-term interests of the general public in provision of a service or a facility.
I mean, can I just come in there?
Of course, go for it.
Only because I suppose I've seen some, not all, but some community assets that when something really quite radical has been suggested, as in maybe a training centre or something to help within the community, that's been turned down, and then it's been sold off. So, you know, I'm all in favour of something or anything that will help communities. So why would we then set about not looking to use that asset alternatively within the community, but we're very keen to get rid of it? I mean, that's and that's part of the checks and balances, I suppose. But that does none of us any good. And as I've said, we're custodians of these assets. They're not ours. I feel sometimes that people in local authority feel like it's theirs, and it's not. These assets are public assets. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Councillor Holly.
Yeah, I tend to agree with some of what George just said, and Matthew. I think there's two issues that struck out there. Is what is the role of the local authority when it comes to a community asset, and what is the minimum provision or the minimum acceptable community involvement that he would accept. It's in the old in the city. In the totality of the city, you've got a number of community councils, you've got town councils, what have you. So there is, as Matthew said, an acceptable responsibility under those community community councils, etc., which you haven't got within the city boundaries. So within certain parts of the city, anyway. And I think there's an issue then about how you engage with the community. But I think that those two are quite important issues, and issues that when we compile our final report, we need to take them into consideration.
Thank you, Chris. I tend to agree with you as well. I know that both Councillor Jones and Councillor Fitzgerald also put in some submissions as a part of the inquiry. Would either of you like to raise any extra points at this stage? Councillor Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I mean, I just submitted the submission to point out that, you know, there are parts of Swansea where community assets have always been held by the community council, and certainly that is the case in Pentlegare. And, you know, there have been, I think, a number of successes. We have delivered a sports field, we've delivered a pavilion, all run by the community council. The village hall, a problematical building because it is an old building, the old school building, is managed and maintained by the community council. There is one comment I would make, and I think I briefly mentioned it in my submission. The asset can be transferred to the council, and I'll illustrate by mentioning Pentlegare Pond, which was transferred to the Friends about 20 odd years ago, and they have successfully brought it back to life. They've cleared the dump vehicles, they've planted, they've landscaped. It is a lovely facility, appreciated by many who use it and fish there and use it for other recreational purposes. However, what has happened now is that Swansea Council have approved a housing development, and the runoff of surface water from this development has been allowed via the planning process to carry it down quite a lengthy slope into the pond. So there are huge pollution issues that are ongoing, and there are seemingly no solutions to at the moment. So it's just to flag up that, you know, an asset can be transferred, but then the council itself agrees to certain changes that then impact, and usually negatively, on that asset. So I think it's something we need to be aware of. It's fine transferring that asset, but there can be assets that could certainly be adversely affected by further decisions that the council take along the line. So that's all I want to say, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. I find that's very interesting, because the impact of council decisions on transferees in the future and their form of being able to redress any issues, that's got to be something that we look at in terms of any agreements for transfer going forward. And the example you gave there, Wendy, is obviously the council has made a subsequent decision that's negatively affected how the transferee is going to go about their business or look after the standard of the thing that they're taking over. And it's an example in itself, but I'm sure that could be parallel to lots of different scenarios with buildings, with other pieces of ground, how the council make decisions around the asset they've transferred. So I definitely think that's something that we need to factor into our considerations going forward. Does anybody else have any other issues that they would like to raise out of the submissions that they put forward?
Can I just come back, responding in part to something that was said and touching a bit on our submission, an area I didn't talk about. We heard a few times there the word custodianship, and I quite agree. The council should be the custodians of these public assets. The problem is, in quite a lot of cases, these public assets under council ownership are falling into dereliction. And some of them are listed buildings that's actually a legal duty to maintain. And I quite understand, I'm not criticising the council, I quite understand the reasons for this, which are resource constraints. But actually community asset transfer can provide a means to get out of that problem, to avoid the legal issues of the listed building falling down, if that's what's going on, and to ensure that the asset remains in both good condition and community use. We're not necessarily talking here about assets which are currently providing benefit to the council. We're talking in a number of cases about empty and decaying assets, which could be given a better future through asset transfer.
Thank you. We also had another submission from Councillor Mike Dirk, who I don't think can join us today online. I just wanted to summarise a few of the points. It's been circulated with the papers, but Mike was saying about the success of communities being able to take on assets or be able to run assets in their community. And he gave an example of the Phoenix Centre and the transformational impact that he believed it had on the community in Town Hill. Now, he also went on to tell us about how those assets can generate and almost give a community regeneration to an area and support wider aims than the asset themselves, because you talked about dealing with crime, giving people the opportunities for work, dealing with sort of social cohesion and a number of other issues. It's worth reading the chapter of the research paper that he put together, which gives a good potted history really of what's happened at the Phoenix Centre and the trust that was developed from it. I think he was really, to sort of underline what you're saying, he was trying to show the positive potential of community-run assets, even though in the sense that maybe the Phoenix Centre example is not a traditional community asset, because it was something that was funded directly by government funding and using council land, and probably preceded when community asset transfer was in existence. But I'm sure if he was here, he would be saying how strongly he agreed with that. Has anybody got any other points that they would like to raise in this section before we move on to looking at the examples from other authorities?
Chair?
Yeah, of course.
Just a general point, being sort of a new councillor. I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, but it's been quite a steep learning curve. I've only been in the post for 2 years. And until I attended this session here, I had very little or sort of no idea as to what community asset transfer was. So, but I did read the city and county as policy, and I did feel that could do with a bit of an upgrade, because there's some terminology in there that I would probably need some clarification on. And then, you know, considering the others that I looked at, the Southampton and Bristol ones that were there, I mean, from those examples, they're outside of Wales. I could see that there were policies that I felt it was sort of more user-friendly and accessible to somebody wishing to take on a community asset transfer, and others, of course, and to consider the possibility of well, the possibility sort of clearly outlining what needs to be done to effect a smooth transfer, and of course, and to sort of ensure a degree of sustainability. I mean, CAT is a challenge, and the more help and advice that you can get, I mean, surely must be a good thing. And what I'm leading on to here is I feel that I don't know whether I'm alone in this, but I'm sure councillors could do with some idea as to what a CAT is. And I'm sure an appropriate degree, or I would say levels of training could be devised so that it could bring, well, councillors like myself up to speed with what we've been discussing here this evening. You know, like I said earlier, had I not attended these sessions, I would have had little idea as to what it is, and I feel that, you know, the more knowledge that we could have as councillors could really be a good thing. You know, I feel we need some kind of toolkit to prepare ourselves for the time when I'm sure we're going to be asked and to become involved in a community asset transfer.
I think that would be really useful as local members to know that, because obviously one of the first people that anybody interested in community comes to tends to be their local members and their local councillors. So anything that could help in terms of briefing, or at least a schematic of how it works, so that people could sort of be aware, that I think would be really useful. One of the things that I thought would be a good opportunity before we move completely on from this is, does the cabinet member or any of the officers want to say anything at this stage, or would like to make any contributions? Okay, I couldn't see any hands there, so thank you, everyone. If we move on to item 7, which is the desk-based research, we've already circulated the paper involved there, and you'll see that. Thank you to Michelle as well for pulling through the examples, and I've put in one as well. We started off in the paper looking at Southampton as one of the examples that we want to do, as much because it was suggested to us, and having read it, it also made good sense. Rather than sort of rehearse what's already in the papers that you've seen, I thought the key areas were the spirit of the policy, which was different perhaps from ours and most of the ones I could see in Wales. And they were very good, in my mind, looking at the risks of community asset transfer. They spelt them out quite clearly in their policy, or things that we needed to look at. And it was quite clear eligibility criteria. It seemed quite user-friendly and easy to read. I don't know if anybody else had any comments that they wanted to make on the Southampton example. I can't see anything there. Okay, so in terms of the Bristol example, Councillor Holly.
Yeah, I think the Southampton one was quite interesting, in as much as the way it spoke about risk more than anything else, and the fact that who is involved. And I think that's something that we need to understand. It's who's involved and what the risks are. And in many cases, I'm afraid that we do not take that into consideration. And the other one is the timescales as well.
I think that's an important area. And one thing which I forgot to mention, which I also, when reading through the policy, thought was important, is the assessment criteria. So there was a clear idea from the beginning of how you're going to be assessed and what you would need to do to be successful, because it kind of helped format what somebody would see in a business plan or an approach to asset transfer. The next one we had was Bristol City Council, and they had some quite easy to navigate websites and pages and information there. And there's a good, it's picking up the point that was made earlier. There's some good case studies on their site, so people could have a look and see how it'd been successful and what the process was for other people. I don't know if anybody has anything they particularly want to comment on Bristol, but I think it's worth looking at. The next one is quite an interesting example because it's Gateshead, and Gateshead did a bit of survey work about the community asset transfers that had taken place and what they'd learned from them. And if you can see, the key sort of takeaway comments were, we've learned to get political buy-in, and a lot of what we've said earlier today in discussions were making sure councillors, community councils, the local public are brought on side. And they said that not all community asset transfers should be nil rental. which is quite an interesting concept as well, because often community asset transfers are on peppercorn rents or various things, and it could be that it's still feasible to put a stronger rent in for certain properties. And I think that's something to look at. The level of support is key, and that keeps coming through. And I'm particularly interested in the idea of a mentor support, because if we couldn't necessarily do that within the council because of resources, and also it may also be more suitable sometimes to have an external person to talk you through the process as well. They hand their buildings over very carefully, is what they said. And hopefully we would do the same thing here, and I'm sure we do. And the interesting point, they say we're not going anywhere. So once the transfer happens, they're going to keep in contact. And I know that at the last meeting, we all recognised the value of the support that's given from the Cultural Services Department in terms of community centres and the support, the support that's given there. I know resources are again a key thing, but as a recommendation, if resources became available, I would suggest if we could have a similar support system, maybe not as intense, but for people who have had the community asset transfer take place. Understanding the running costs, that was a key thing I think Councillor Bailey raised earlier as well. Understanding the costs involved in it, and getting around the everyday barriers, duty of care, due diligence in running the building, those kinds of things, which we've talked about previously. Is anybody got anything they'd like to raise regards to Gateshead? Okay, well, our authority down the road, down the M4 at Cardiff Council, has a toolkit that they put together for community asset transfer. And it's, is your organisation ready to step up? So it's worth having a look at that. And then Michelle and I looked at some other examples, which you've got at the bottom of particular asset transfers. But I think it's good to have a look around. It's not to say that those things happening elsewhere are better. They're different, and they're worth considering to see if they are improvements to our model and what we could do. Has anybody got any other examples or things that they think we should be considering in terms of research before we take the next steps? That's Holly.
Yeah, I'm going to do a bit of research myself on Big Bob movers in Liverpool, because the Liverpool model on asset transfer was based on an idea that was set up by helping people move in council houses, and then from that they had a repair centre, and the council handed over to this charitable organisation warehouses to store furniture, and they then started to repair furniture. So it all started off on that, and I'm going to look to see whether it's still in operation. If it is, I'll drop Michelle a line and show what it is. The other aspect of this, which having read through them, the one that struck me actually was the Ceredigion and the pool. I thought that was a really good option to put into charitable status and to run the pool, which is something which I think is the way forward when it comes to swimming pools, because the cost of running them.
Yeah, that is an interesting example. One of the other things that hasn't come up that I saw in some of in other policies is the idea of trying to look at small-term licenses, a bit like our yellow licenses with community centres. But I mean, I know we've discussed that before in terms of the problems that provides for gaining funding, because they usually want a security tenure over a period of time. But I think it's quite interesting to see what other people have tried to do in those areas as well. Has anybody got any other points they would like to raise? I can't see any other hands up at the moment. Okay, so if I can move on then to item 8. And item 8 then is for the meeting that's on the 17th of June. And this is when we have a stakeholder discussion. So far, just to update the panel, we've invited representatives from Coed Gwilym, from Mumble Skate Park, Penlan AFC, Swansea Tennis Centre and Underhill Park. And we have got some responses of 3 of those have already confirmed that they will be hoping to attend either in person or online. And I think we'll have a roundtable discussion then, and we can be able to get out some sort of ideas of the experience. If there's anybody who's missing from that list, who you think we should be looking to engage or involved in it, please do. There are other transfers that are happening out there, some of which have been more difficult. So we're aware of those, but unfortunately, some of them we can't invite to the meeting due to some legal status of certain situations. But I think we can probably in a closed session in the future to discuss some of the items that have come up from those as well. Okay, so is there anything else that people wanted to raise on the next meeting's agenda? Okay, then I just want to take this opportunity to thank our guests, especially thank Mr. Lester for coming along on behalf of Swansea Co-Housing, and Councillor Bailey for his submission as well and joining us for the meeting today, and for everybody's contributions, and Councillor Hale and as well for being actively involved in that. If there is any other examples or any bits of information that we haven't yet heard and that people want to share with us, then please do. And I look forward to seeing you all on the 17th at 4:30 of June. And thank you very much, everyone, for attending.